Okay, hello everyone. Good afternoon now I think we're up to. Hopefully you're in the right place. Title's up here. Using Azure Site Recovery to mitigate disaster recovery risk at VMware sites. My name's James Knapp and I am the CTO of VIFX. I won't say too much about us, you can talk to me about us afterwards. But I'm hoping that if you're here, there's two things I know about you. That you have VMware in your environment, hopefully you do, because that's what the talk's about, and that you're looking for a more effective approach to disaster recovery, because those are the key things that we're talking about today. So this session's about an approach that figures out is what's best for you. I'm not predicating or predetermining that ASR is the perfect fit. It's more about a framework for assessing your options. But having said that, many businesses operate with high levels of risk, and Azure Site Recovery is a simple and obvious choice to mitigate those risks. And through the talk, I'll explain why I believe this to be the case. So by way of agenda, today I'm going to talk about how DR as a service is able to bridge the gap when you have a DR gap, so delivered as a service rather than necessarily you owning or operating it. About how to develop a defensible and actionable position that you are taking with regards to how you're going to mitigate your DR risk. We'll look at some Azure Site Recovery considerations, and I'll explain to you some real-world experiences that we've had working on the beta program. So, as people have told me, ASR has been a much anticipated product to come out. There's been a beta program. Some of you may have been involved in it. In fact, probably a good time to ask, was anyone involved in the ASR beta that went on? Yeah, very good. Okay, a couple of people, thank you. So, on to the first topic. DR as a service, disaster recovery, delivered as a service, bridges the gap. And you may say, what gap? Is there a gap in my DR coverage right now? Well, I'd guess that for the majority of people there could be. Large enterprise will have this sorted, but I think this is predominantly a mid-market play where something like DR isn't considered very well, or it's put on the back burner, or it's done piecemeal. And sometimes in those kind of environments, there can be this perception that having backups is going to be suitable enough for providing my DR coverage. That I've got a backup system, I back up all my critical and key data, I ship those tapes off-site, and I think I'll probably be able to get it back up and running in a couple of weeks if something really went down. And I think that people kind of keep existing in this belief that I don't need to test that theory, you know, I'll just pass that belief through and the business accepts it. But, you know, I don't know about you, but in my real-world experiences, 1 to 2 weeks of off-site recovery time, even if you're not a transactional kind of organisation, it's just BS. It just doesn't happen. You know, you're looking at least 6 weeks to get up to any kind of modicum of the number of systems recovered. If you're left with a box of tapes, you've got to find someone who's going to source your equipment, you've got to find somewhere to put it, you've got to start recovering systems, you've got to rebuild the backup server, you've got to index the tapes, you've got to run backups, and then you've got to think about how that load parallelizes as you run multiple recoveries all together. It's going to take a long time, that's for certain. So this is, you know, like the first point about how you might go about qualifying what the realistic gap is in your DR strategy. The second one is you're probably further back in the queue for prioritization than you think you are. You may well be outsourced for some of your services. You may be running in someone's data center. There are good providers of service. Revera, Datacom are getting great traction with running people's workloads in their data centers. And maybe you don't have DR with them, and you know that they have these DR services. So you think, well, if push comes to shove, they'll give me some DR, they'll run that capability. But the good providers in those areas, and some of them are good, they'll let you know you're well back in the queue. The people who pay are first, the people who paid and tested it, they're ahead of you. And if there's a regional type disaster that affects a lot of people, you're going to have to wait in the queue before you can get access to the environments to start to run up any of those things. It's still there, but it's just a little qualifier on how long it would really take before you got back up and running. The next point around gap is in BCP. So again, I won't put that up there. In my experience, in our experiences, most organisations have some kind of business continuity planning in place, but typically it's run out of the business itself, not from IT. So the kind of scenarios they're planning for are being unable to access the site, about having people and communicating with the people so they have somewhere to go so that they can then interact with the customers. But it's not really thinking about access to IT services, or it can fall into this trap on occasions. So don't assume that a BCP plan means that you have a DR plan, especially if your BCP plan is focused on getting people access into a new site and your IT is run from a completely different site. Well, what about the scenario now where that site's unavailable, or massive vendor failure, anything like that? So these are things just to qualify through, or to potentially, this is an IT audience, to help you to highlight what the real risk is to the people in your organisation, so you can get some action on getting a proper DR plan in place or improving the one that you have. So my final point here on the gap is that boards really hate risk. And my interpretation of a board in any organisation is really just about business risk mitigation. Do we have enough money in the bank to keep operating? If we don't, we need to think of our lines of credits. Do we have the right services to take to the market so that we're relevant and we're ahead of our competitors? They're not thinking in IT terms, nor should they, but if you qualify to them the risk that exists, they're going to do something about it, because boards hate risk. So they can't do something once they know about it and once they have a believable position. I've seen situations where for 7 years they've operated with an assumption that they had a DR posture that they were miles away from, just because it was kind of unchallenged. Just don't tell me otherwise, I don't want to know. So I think if you can highlight what the real risk is in any scenario, you can get action on the plans that you're proposing. So then, thinking about DR as a service and how that opens up possibilities for us in trying to get better DR coverage, the first and obvious point would be no second site is needed. We don't need to build or own a data centre. We might like the idea of going and building another data centre. It might be safe, comfortable territory for us, but we don't need to think about all those undifferentiated heavy lifting tasks of going and building infrastructure and services and facilities. In terms of being able to provide protection, we can protect only what's necessary. We don't need to go out and protect all of the systems in our environment. We can just figure out which are the critical ones and protect those alone. And this DR as a service rising in prominence really reminds me of the early days of virtualization, and using the dirty words again of VMware. But when VMware was making its mark, and they'd talk about the democratization of disaster recovery because the infrastructure could provide this service. Well, now cloud's doing the same thing. It's a democratization of DR capabilities. Any site, any environment that's connected to the internet, so that's all of them, is able to have some level of DR protection that's appropriate for them. With DR as a service, we can test, which is also something that's non-trivial, has been non-trivial in the past, and we can test in isolation. There's obvious benefits of that, not impacting production and so forth. And we can only run and pay for VMs when we're enacting DR. This is an important point. But what I don't mean to imply by this is that DR as a service per unit is necessarily cheaper. That's not a conclusion from that statement. It's a possibility that overall DR as a service is cheaper, but we need to think through costs of operations and testing and the number of workloads we're protecting. So the ability to only run and pay for VMs when we're enacting DR, that helps that cost case move forward. Because again, it's really easy to look at it on a spreadsheet or on a glossy and go, yeah, but the cost of running DR for that one system, I can provide that cheaper with my own infrastructure. Sure, you can, but you need to think about it in context of everything else you're doing, of everything else you're operating, of all the supporting facilities that are required, of all the supporting infrastructure. So this point about only running and paying for VMs when you're enacting DR, it's kind of a push forward. It's a reason, it's a motivator that can make DR as a service an attractive option. So from there, like I say, the focus for me on this talk is really, it's about a framework for options analysis. In this case, we're talking about options for DR as a service or disaster recovery, but the options we could be comparing could be anything. So this approach is very much extensible. It could be about whether to go to cloud or not for production. It could be about what the best method for availability protection is. It could be about who's going to be the best provider for us for operational support for components of our environment. The key things to me through the analysis are that it's defensible and actionable. So I'll explain a little bit more what I mean by that. In terms of defensibility, building our fortress, when we come forward with our proposals or our options, execs are always going to want to know that all options have been considered. The decision makers are very perceptive at sniffing out whether or not an option that you didn't like or didn't like the colour of, didn't like the smell of, is being put to the back burner. So you really need to be upfront and show at a high level how all the options are being considered. Sure, we could build a data centre. Sure, we could go to a local provider and use their DR service. Sure, we could go to the cloud, and there's different cloud options. So come forward with multiple options at the start, whittle them down, and then focus in and narrow in on the ones that are the leading options. The other thing is, to be defensible, we need to be objective enough to consider solutions that might fall outside our comfort zone. And that's sort of the other side of the same coin, in that you'll be sniffed out if you're hiding a solution that, for whatever reason, you're just a little bit uncomfortable of. So, you know, as a pitch for my company and what we do, that's how we like to come in and help people consider all the options objectively at a high level. Or, you know, you can do that internally as well. Depends on experience, exposure, and skill sets. But that's up to you. The other part is around making it actionable. And so what I mean by making it actionable is, it's great if we've been broad in our thinking and we've thought about all the different options that are possible, but we have to be able to compare them objectively, we have to go through the steps of saying, what would it look like to actually go and implement this solution? What would be the reality of doing this? So we have to have an action plan that will assess and plan, prove, and how we might even go through and execute any of these options. And we have to base that in some sort of reality. It can't be just done off brochures. So we need to know examples from the field of people who've done it before. If it's new technology, then we might have to build some risk into that part of the model and talk about pilot phases. But it's about coming from this sort of empathetic point of view where we're really planning on making this option live and real and not just giving it some cursory thought through, so going through it in some detail. So defensible and actionable are the key ones there. Then the next part is, when we go through our options analysis, is to separate needs alignment from cost at first. So what I mean is, we start with 10 or so options. We whittle it down to 4. We've got a baseline of what we're doing now and 3 other leading options that might be, yeah, we want to build a data center and use SRM because it's a VMware site. Or we want to move everything into Revera and use their DR services that are available. Or we want to go to the cloud and we want to use Azure Site Recovery so we can leave our production in place and we're going to just replicate our services up to Azure over in Sydney. So we're going to then, first of all, separate needs alignment from cost by coming through and looking at what are the key requirements in the environment. So this is like a subset of reference architecture. In reference architecture, you're going to go right into the weeds and you're going to look at every requirement that is needed. You're going to categorize and organize them. You're going to work out the best solution that goes through. But when we want to do this at a strategic level, we've just got to get to the nub of what's going to make a difference in our world. And I'll talk to some of these criteria on the next slide. but but the point I want to make here is that we want to separate needs alignment from cost. And there's a very good reason for doing so, because when we look at the cost, we can't predetermine whether or not the business wants to invest in this area or whether they want to save money in this area. Their decision on that point might be influenced about what these different options bring. And if, for example, DR as a service, you know, we get this. We can all talk about it till we go blue in the face about how we'll be more streamlined. We won't have to manage these parts of the environment. We'll get to be able to focus on the stuff you've been asking us to do. But, pardon me, but the business might not see the value in that until they can go, oh, okay, doing this DR as a service is cost equivalent to other options, or it's, you know, plus or minus, whichever way it is. Therefore, it's worth my while to go through with this exercise. And so we need to provide the tools to the business for them to be able to make informed decisions. So that's separation of alignment from cost. So then, focusing in on the requirements, or focusing in a broad sense on the requirements, thinking broadly about requirements. I'm not saying these are necessarily exactly the ones that you would drill in on. You'd go through this in a consultative manner with the business to find out, or, you know, using your site knowledge, what are the key requirements that you need to drill in on. But talking about some of these ones for a moment, technical fit, that's the easiest. You know, that's the one we all know. That's, are our workloads supported? Are the size of the workloads? Are the size of the disks? Are the versions of the operating systems and the backup systems and the integration points? Are they all supported in the platform that we're aiming for? That's easy. But other key requirements that are probably a little bit more nuanced but have a real bearing are things like, how easy is this model to adopt? If I'm moving from a deployment model that I really know and understand well into something that is quite different or foreign to what I know, it could be hard to adopt, and maybe we in the business don't have an appetite to do that. So picking on Amazon, if you go to AWS, you pretty much know with certainty you're going to have to re-architect some of your applications to be able to run in that environment. I'm not judging that, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but you just need to realise your ease of adoption is not as much as if, say with ASR, all I need to do is install the agents, run some configuration servers at the other end, and replicate and leave my production systems as is. So depending on if ease of adoption is a critical factor, you know, there's some decision points or some comparisons that can be made. The next one would be innovation. And I think, you know, that's the essence of cloud, is innovation. Why have I adopted cloud models in the first place? Because I want this rapid evolution of the kind of services and features that are available to me, and I don't want to have to go and build innovation into my platform. I want my provider to do it for me. You've got to figure out whether or not that's something that is important to the customer or important in your environment. But if it is, you want to buy into a platform of innovation. And innovation can differ. You know, you can outsource but not get innovation. You can insource and not get innovation. It's very hard if you're running your own environments to keep up with building in the latest technologies and features, and especially with hardware, you only get a chance every 3 or 5 years to refresh the infrastructure itself. But and even with local cloud providers, you know, they're going to build an environment and they're going to sweat that out as long as they can. Some of them are better than others at providing innovation, but you know, the truest innovation is in the cloud providers. They're frequently updating, frequent code releases, you know, movements towards all the stuff you would have been hearing today: OMS, automation integration, DevOps, CI/CD. That's the stuff that, even if you don't need it now, that platform's innovating, and that's something for you to tap into. So it's thinking outside of the requirements that you might have for DR, what the context is for the rest of the environment. Other areas would be around things like operations, how much harder it is to operate that environment, or how many fewer people I'll need to operate it, what else can those people be doing instead. Vendor alignment might talk to how much I like my existing partners or dislike them, or my desire to inject new ones, or if they're unknown vendors, then how am I going to feel about bringing them in, proven or unproven? And proven can be around vendors, but proven can also be around technologies. So then again, thinking about that in context for Microsoft Azure and Site Recovery, this ASR has been in beta for quite a long time now. There's been some customers that have been running it. It's developed groundswell. You can look at that and you can judge that as either proven, or you can say you might think you want it to be more proven prior. But I think that already goes some way to talking about the provenness of that platform. The next area I want to talk about is de-risking the DR as a service design. Now you need to do this de-risking for each of the options you're going to consider, but because there's a talk about disaster recovery as a service, focusing in specifically on de-risking DR as a service, there's a few things you can do like dependency mapping. If you haven't already done it, figuring out which are the key apps, what services they all depend on, so that we can make sure that we protect the entire service and not just component servers. I don't know, you may already be doing that, but a lot of people aren't. There's tools out there that can do that for you. There's Blue Stripe, there's other tools around, but it's definitely a key way that you can de-risk your design and make sure that it's going to protect the right components and have the right levels of protection for those components, so the right RTOs and RPOs and retention. The next point might be around network connectivity, and we can probably start out with just using internet connectivity and test the pilot phase, but we want to be aware of what are going to be the complexities as we scale up for having higher bandwidth connections, having more deterministic connections, so that might be using ExpressRoute, but we can plan beyond. The other part of de-risking designs is not assuming that your initial phase is going to mimic or scale as you grow. You know, that's the classic problem with things like VDI. Oh, I could run 4 virtual desktops on my infrastructure as is, but as I scaled it up to 100, suddenly everything started to groan. So the same thing with networks. Just think about how things are going to scale. Another part might be thinking through how you're going to make it usable, what you're going to do for testing and failback. Start thinking about these things prior. And coming back to BCP, if I'm going to evolve my tests for disaster recovery, there may be a point that I want to evolve those tests to the point that I can recover all my key production systems in the cloud and assume that I have no on-premises site available for my staff to work from either. In which case, they're going to need to go to a terminal. They're going to want to be able to run some kind of virtual desktop and use maybe services like Remote App so that they can run their desktops and their key applications right next to the production workloads all in the cloud. And other operational considerations, I touched on some of them earlier, but it might be about what are the changes in skill sets that are going to be needed, what are new skill sets that are going to be needed. There might be cost management for the cloud, there might be service level monitoring for the cloud. So start thinking through some of those things. In terms of cost comparisons, that's the other side of when I was saying before, separating needs alignment from cost. Now we come through to cost. This can't be ignored if we're going to take forward a defensible position. As you can see from the chart, the key elements of this are separating CapEx and OpEx, because some places do have a problem with a shift to larger OpEx from a traditional CapEx model of project-based. And looking at horizons of ideally 5 years, but potentially longer. We pick normally 5 years for our analysis because it's a fair representation to say, well, we'll have at least one infrastructure refresh in that period. We might sweat our assets a bit longer, but we'll assume we'll do one at least in 5 years. And it also is a fair show of what true operating costs are for cloud, because cloud's a pure OpEx model, and so it's the same cost year in, year out, month in, month out. So we get to compare that against something that's has more discrete steps in it, like an on-prem model. We want to compare relative costs, and the reason we call out relative rather than total cost is that there are some things in an organisation no one will ever understand what they're paying for or how they're paying for it, and we don't want to get caught up and distracted by those minute details. We want to just compare the costs that are relative from one model to the other. Yes, they're both going to require infrastructure. They're both going to require some setup. They're both going to require someone to operate them. Those are the knowns. Anything else that's about service management functions that are shared or I don't know, but centralized accounting functions. We'll put those to the side because there's no point in wasting our time trying to get to a level of detail that's not really going to inform our position. The other thing is about recognising situation-specific costs. So this becomes very personal to the organisation in which you're dealing, or your organisation, because it depends what's happening, what the motivations are for this program or any other. If there's major development programs going on, I can think of one example where an insurance company is acquiring other insurance companies. In the back end, they're merging all their insurance databases and systems, and so they're going through massive programs of change about how they're going to develop and test and merge those environments. Then for them, the cost of developer downtime is a very real cost that wants to be showing up. So if we need to recognise that because we need to have a stronger DR position or a stronger availability position, and we'd say for every hour of downtime that means 200 developers at $1 gazillion an hour, then we need to recognise those costs by risk in some way in our cost model. Or if that's not for us, then we don't include it at all. But it becomes site-specific that you want to think about those things. I want to think about transition efforts, so the cost to move to the new model, and we also don't want to forget about any additional tooling. So this is about being fair and true to each option. If we move to DR as a service, we may well and likely will need to invest in additional tool sets on site so that we can make sure we understand the performance of those systems, if they're production, if they're DR systems, the availability, the currency of those systems, the network performance, the network bandwidth usage, the costs that we are spending on the cloud, and then demarcate it down by different business units. So we don't want to ignore those costs and have an unfair comparison. So I've managed to get almost 30 minutes into the presentation without talking about ASR. I think probably about time I got onto it. So talking about ASR itself specifically, if you haven't worked out by now, I'm not focusing on any of the use cases for ASR that are related to replicating Hyper-V sites or System Center sites through to ASR, or two sites that are both running System Center and Windows Server or Hyper-V. I'm really talking about just that use case on the right-hand side there of VMware to the cloud. And I'm unashamed about that. The reason is because we come from very traditional, me and my customers come from very traditional VMware environments. We're looking at this as here's a foothold to use cloud to provide a better protection mechanism at potentially a better cost and better service level. So that's what we're focusing on in this one. And then if we drill down a little bit further and we look at the deployment architecture of ASR itself, and we think about how we're trying to protect, you may be well aware of this already, but the kind of sites we're talking about, they're a VMware site, they've got VMs and some physical servers, and from there, the way that ASR protects, it's a reasonably traditional approach, and it's been done through acquisition of the company Inmarge that you're probably aware of. But Inmarge has these components that mean that it doesn't just have to be a Hyper-V site to be able to protect it. We can put this agent on the VMs or on the physical machines, the mobility service, and we can track the changes that are running inside the VMs, the in-memory state changes, and we can then replicate those or send those through to the process server and have that sent through to the master target server in Azure, and then we can use that combined with our configuration server so that we can keep those changes in lockstep. We can set our retention parameters for frequency of change, for retention of change, for application consistency. And so even though it's not integrated into the core of the hypervisor, it allows us to be heterogeneous in our approach to the hypervisor that we support. I mentioned before that one of the criteria you might be considering when you're analysing your different options is innovation. And innovation doesn't just mean technical innovation. It can also mean cost model innovation. So I think a big plus here, and something that I was really pleased to hear, is that ASR doesn't charge for the master target or the config server that you run in the cloud. So there's the components that you can already reduce the cost on. As a provider, Microsoft is recognising that it needs to keep ahead of the game. And as more people come on board with this platform, there's more things that they can provide to you as part of the core service. So that's good. I don't need to pay or run for those config servers. So that's a good example. And of course, as you'd expect, multi-tenanted. There's going to be more than one person that wants to use ASR in the world. There's ability to secure the data channel with encryption. There's ability to have consistency in that data channel with things like ExpressRoute. I can support lots of different operating systems, not just Windows, Linux versions as well. And we talked about the heterogeneous support before. So in terms of what needs to be done to set up ASR, I wasn't quite brave enough to go to the demo gods and open up my chicken and take its innards out and do that live on stage. Nor did I really think there was a great deal of value in doing it. But just to step you through some of the things that you need to think about and do, there's only 8 here. It's actually not that hard. When you do it, you need to obviously create your vault. You need to select a site or a region. We're going to, in all likelihood, set Australia as our region, Southeast Australia. We of course, want to run through our quick start guides and read about what we're going to do before we do it, so we just look out for any potholes along the way. We'll set up those config servers that we talked about, configuration, master target, the process server. We'll set those up in our locale, and then we'll register. We can register our vCenter. It can do automatic discovery of the VMs. And then we get down, and we will have thought about this prior, of course, what kind of protection levels we want, and we can set that by those systems. We can set the frequency of replication, the retention of those protection points, and how often we want to do things like the application consistency. We might not want to do that all the time because we might need to script anything to have a set of systems to be able to quiesce them at the right time. So we might want to have that at a different frequency. We'll protect our VMs and select the disks that we're going to protect along the way, and we'll create our recovery plans so that we can do that by either sets of applications, whole sites, or even individual systems if we want. Have different recovery plans for different scenarios, and then we can go through and test those and make sure they operate the way that we want. And from that point, we can then evolve those tests, and we can make them fancier as we go. We can look to integrate end-user access, like I was saying before, or potentially even end-user access and end-user systems being brought up in the disaster recovery site. So in terms of real-world experiences, we were lucky enough to get involved with ASR on the beta program with a Microsoft customer, and we worked with them along the way. I haven't actually asked their permission to talk about them specifically or name them, so I'll just say they're a large tertiary institute. They're not Cambridge University, but they're near Cambridge. I didn't say what country, but you probably guessed who they are. But in terms of what their goals were, they had goals for running this ASR program. Their pilot goals, as you'd expect, and hopefully you'll see this should align with the kind of goals you might have, we want to have disaster recovery where none existed before. They want to replicate, failover, and get remote access to those systems. They want to have quick recovery, and they want to start their move to the cloud. So this is the safe toe in the water for using cloud services. If DR as a service is going to work, I can move on to production systems and other ones. But if it doesn't, I'll need to rethink. So what did we learn along the way as we did this? There were some challenges, nothing major, but there were still things worth working through and learning from. There were some complexities in connecting after the failover. This was mostly due to the quality of the internet connection, so very much then they used this as learnings for the next phase that they're going to go through to build into the budgets dedicated connections, ExpressRoute connections. There were some challenges around OS upgrades needed, and there's this perennial resistance to upgrading in environments. I don't know why that is, mate. Application owners hold us by the short and curlies, and we're never allowed to touch their systems. But anyway, it drove the motivation for them to actually go through and get to recently supported versions of the OS, so that can't be a bad thing. And there was a little challenge around the version of vSphere they were running, which was current, but the specific connector that we were using to get through. So it's just really about checking your documentation and making sure that you whittle out any of those kind of niggly things through the pilot phase so that you can be assured of what's going to happen when you go through in production. So from there, for this site, what happens next? This is their nirvanic state where everything is rosy in the future. Their next steps are based on the pilot that they did. They were very happy with the results. They took their learnings. They're going through and they're going to target 100 guests now to run through in ASR for production DR. They're looking at the dedicated network, like I said. They're thinking through about the operational aspects. So they're going to get an ops guy who's focused on this DR as a service. That's their role. They're going to be looking after the health and vitality of the system. And they're going to expand their testing, looking at groups of servers to be recovered, as well as end-user connectivity for that environment. So, you know, that's good. It's given them confidence to proceed. It's given us confidence that this is a viable solution that we bring into the portfolio when we're doing our options analysis and we're comparing them. So that's all been good. In terms of bringing it together now, it's coming towards the end of my presentation. But before I wrap up and open up to questions, the only other thing for me really was to think about what other ideas does this opportunity of ASR stimulate? How else could we use this? What else might we do? Well, you know, as we talked about before, and that use case there, disaster recovery as a service is a good opportunity to test your toe in the water and think about how cloud might be used for production systems. So we could use ASR as a migration method to replicate out to Azure and then flip it. At the moment, we'd be running on-prem active, DR as a service, passive, and we could flip that. And then eventually turn this off in production site, and that could become our production. So using ASR as a method to migrate to Azure. The next one would be around production replicas for testing. So if we have protected key systems, and those key systems are ones that further development is required on, we need multiple sets of environments, and they're needed for UAT and SIT and different things, we can take those DR replicas and we can start to clone them off, and we can provide access to different people in different areas, and they can do their testing up in the cloud. So it's a slightly different route than the developers getting accounts where they get to provision into Azure, but rather IT centrally protecting those systems and then presenting those to the developers or the DevOps teams so they can use them. And the last one, which I'll admit I haven't actually tested in anger, but is conceptually an idea that might have some weight, is again, a lot of our customers will already be in a consumption model from a local provider, a local managed infrastructure provider. Example, Revera or Datacom, someone like those guys. Most of those people have this abstraction level in front of it called vCloud Director that abstracts the systems that they're presenting through to the customer. And VCD doesn't really lend itself very well to integrating with any other clouds other than the one you're in to provide protection or usage because of the abstraction method, of the way that it hides the IDs of the systems, that you don't have any vCenter access. So I don't think that limitation should be any reason that we wouldn't consider ASR for those type of customers, considering that we could treat them all as though they were physical machines. They're VMs, but I can still just put the mobility service on each of those VMs and I could protect them. So that's a possibility. It's something worth going through in a bit more detail to test, but it's just about thinking laterally about what other options are out there. So in conclusion, I suppose I'd like to think that I've hit this goal of talking through and explaining to you from our point of view why using ASR is a good choice for mitigating DR in environments, but also the importance of having an open-minded, impartial analysis of your options to be able to present a defensible and actionable position so that you get that supported and you can ultimately run projects that are interesting and successful, and I think ASR is a great way to do that as well. That's the end of my presentation. The only other thing to show you is other sessions that might be of interest. There's one on SharePoint coming up now. There's one on Exchange later on today. And I think Ben and some of the guys here are going to be doing the backup as a service one tomorrow, which should be good with some practical demos as well. I'll be around later on after this is probably the easiest thing if you want to grab me and ask any questions. You would have seen the resources and session evaluation, but that's the end of my presentation, and if you've got any questions, please ask. Thank you.